They teach you, in nursing school, to make decisions with your hands before your mind catches up. When a body is bleeding, there is no ethical debate that matters. There is only the practical ledger of rinse, clamp, stitch. It was nearly 3 a.m. when the hospital doors blew inward, and a storm of black uniforms and heavy boots took the corridor like a tide. The smell that hit me first was iron, hot blood, and then the colder tang of something chemical and dangerous, like petrol left in the sun. A man was thrown onto the nearest gurney, his white shirt a red constellation. They shoved a gun close enough to my ribs to announce that my choices were no longer mine. I remember the light in the emergency room. Too white, like a hospital had borrowed the sun and kept it on a dimmer switch. I remember the small mechanical smells. Iodine, antiseptic, the plasticky wax of the gurney's rails. I remember my hands, moving in the habitual sacred choreography nurses learn, sterile pads, clamps, gentle pressure. He watched me the whole time, gray eyes like winter, and when my fingers finally coaxed the bullet from his side, he made a sound like someone surprised at a gift. "Steady hands," he said, and when his fingers closed around mine, it was not possessive. It wasn't courtship either. It was an assessment, a tether, a way to keep the world from sliding into something altogether stranger. His palm was warm and calloused, as if he had spent his life holding things that were not meant to be gentle. The men who had brought him in did not thank me. They locked eyes with me as if they had read my file and decided my utility. "Boss trusts you," said their leader, and the words were not an invitation, but an accounting. The next thing I knew, a prick at the back of my neck, and the world folded into velvet. I woke in silk. The change was dizzying. The nauseous tilt of being drugged, the terrible clarity of being somewhere that had been built to impress. Marble floors, heavy curtains that drank the sound of footsteps, chandeliers that dropped fractured suns across the walls. I was still wearing my scrubs, stained with his blood. The difference between the hospital and this house was not simply wealth. It was intention. Hospitals are neutral wounds and repairs. This place had been constructed to declare war and make treaties on the same breath. He entered the room with the quiet arrogance of someone accustomed to doors opening on command. Bandages hugged the curve of his ribs like temporary maps. His hair was damp in a way that suggested rain or sweat, and when he moved, the house seemed to inhale. Adrian Moretti. The name is a thing that rearranges grown men's posture. The newspapers called him brutal, efficient, a necessary evil for some. The children on the street learned to say his name like a story about dragons. Up close, he was a man assembled from angles and old griefs. Further away, he was a theory. "You saved me," he said without heat. There was no flourish in his gratitude. It was a ledger entry. "That makes you mine for now." Fear lives in small administrative details. The gun at my side spoke, but so did the way the curtains moved, the way the servants avoided eye contact, the way everything here had been designed to keep you small and compliant. I had to steel myself not to think of my life as a file that could be archived in his trunk of favors. "You can't keep me," I said, professional indignation flaring because defiance is a better drug sometimes than clenched teeth. "This is illegal." He amused himself with the smallest thing, a ghost of a smile, and walked closer. He smelled of smoke and detergent and that faint iron tang that clung to his bandages, his eyes fixed on me, and for a second the world reduced to the cold, precise cut of him. "Leave," he said like an explanation of weather, "and I'll burn the world to find you." It should have been theatrically frightening. Instead, his voice registered as a simple fact, the kind of sentence you use to describe the tide. Maybe it was the particular flatness in which he could order ruin, or perhaps it was my shock wearing the wrong gloves of expected outrage, but I discovered then that fear and fascination can be siblings. They sat at the same kitchen table. The house made sure I could not simply leave. There were men who moved like carved things, efficient and careful and lethal. They fed me the kinds of meals a prisoner receives, well-made, in generous portions, always with an eye to making you complicit, well-fed, comfortable, disarmed in the most domestic way. Yet the bedsheets were too soft for peace. I slept with my senses jagged like a poorly tuned instrument. The quiet clicks of servants moving, the distant rumble of a city I had once been part of, the steady, harrowing rhythm of being watched. The first night I woke with my hands folded across my stomach, feeling ridiculous and angry at my throat. How do you teach a kind of courage that's about staying small so you don't get noticed and then ask someone to unlearn all that? I had patched men and women on the brink for years, but I had never tended to a life that fought you on the other side. I stayed because leaving was worse than being stolen. Sometimes the world favors the illusions that keep us unhurt. He was a man who would, in other rooms, order men into graves and then write them off with the same hand he used to sign contracts. In my room, he was a patient with a ragged breath and a bandage to keep clean. The contradiction was a living animal I could not ignore. He was both a shape I wanted to avoid and a human torsion that scraped at the edges of my professional compassion. That night I learned, barely and trembling, that mercy can walk into the spaces where monsters live. And sometimes the line between salvation and damnation is a simple stitch. They put me in a side room and called it an infirmary, as if naming something arranged a moral geography. Stainless steel trays gleamed under the soft lamplight. The cabinets held instruments that smelled of purpose and order. It was grotesque. A hospital tucked into a mansion that had been built to intimidate cities. But it was a place where I could apply my hands and pretend the rest was a problem for the robbers in the parlor. In the first days, I moved like a woman with a debt to balance. Changed dressings, check for infection, coax appetite back. He lay in a bed that seemed designed to make him look smaller, though nothing about him truly was. He watched me with an attention that felt like temperature. Sometimes his gaze flattened me. Sometimes it warmed like a hearth. The inconsistency made me uneasy in a way that the gun had not. I preferred predictable danger. There was a night I tried to leave. The corridor to the service exit smelled of wet stone and bleach. I had stuffed a small bag with essentials, bandages, antiseptic, a change of clothes, and the plan was as simple as any act of survival: leave when the guard's rotation changed. I suppose I had rehearsed the motion to convince myself I was not a hostage of circumstance. A boot hit the floor behind me with the precise sound a predator makes before it reveals its teeth. He had walked down the corridor in silence, the house parting for him like water. He stopped, as if surprised at being found in a domestic act. "You cannot leave," he said. The words were not in order exactly. They were a fact laid out like a map. I said the obvious things: that confined people could not be kept without consequences, that the law would care, that nurses were not property. He closed the distance between us and cupped my face. The intimacy of the gesture made my skin crawl and bloom at once. His palm was solid, and his thumb brushed the skin at my cheekbone like someone checking the temperature of a fever. "Don't be reckless," he murmured. I told him he had no right to tenderness. He smiled like a man with a dead language, part apology, part calculation. "I will protect what I do not want broken," he said. There was a promiscuous irony to it. A man who had ordered people into graves, promising to protect the one person who might make his life less empty. The thought was absurd enough to be dangerous. I pulled free and fled back to the soft clinical light of my infirmary, because work is the armor you can put on when every other garment seems to have been stolen. Routine eased things. There is a solace to the rhythm of care. The way gauze folds in your hand, the small clatter of scissors, the sound of a dressing that has been properly applied. I remind myself I was a professional doing a job, and yet the house rewarded me with other things. A cat that appeared each morning and rubbed its head against my shin, a cup of tea left on the tray with the faint note of lemony sugar, the way his men began to nod to me as if I had become one of the household's acceptable fixtures. Slowly, the edges of him showed. He fed the stray cat beside the fountain with a tenderness that did not fit his reputation. He pressed his lips to his palm after a bad phone call as if tasting a memory. There were moments he would reach for my hand while I was changing a dressing and simply hold it. No command, no expectation, an attempt at a thing we had not yet named. When his thumb brushed the back of my knuckles, something in me recorded it like a physical fact, a memory of touch that could be summoned later. We argued sometimes, because argument is a way to mark territory that isn't muscle or gunpowder. I called him heartless to his face and watched anger shift his features into jagged stone. He called me naive until I wanted to throw something at him, and in an instant I would remember what it was to be a woman trained to patch and not to rage. Our fights were of violent domesticity, raised voices across marble counters, a glass thrown in a fit of pride and frustration, the sound of shattered things like small tragic fireworks. One flash of fury, a glass, a raised voice, ended with him pinning my wrists, fingers like clamps but not cruel, holding me to the cold edge of the counter. His breath was whiskey sweet at my temple. His hand was firm around my wrists, a possessive gesture, and when his lips met mine, it was not tender. It was a violent, searching kiss that announced in the bluntest possible way that things had changed. He tasted of smoke and iron. I tasted the wrongness of the moment and its undeniable animal strain. When it finished, he looked at me with a kind of private astonishment. "I shouldn't want this," he said, voice ragged. We were meticulous about consent after that. We talked. The way two adult people do when they want to fold sharp things into something less dangerous. He would ask, between breaths and soft sentences, if I wanted him close. I would say yes or no, and sometimes the answer would change in the shape of a moment. There were nights when his hands were practiced and careful, and I felt something like ease. There were other nights when his control gave way to a darker need that made me clamp my jaw and hold his wrist like an anchor. We navigated the perilous columns of power and desire with clumsy, human humility. One night, after a smaller skirmish out on the street that left the city smelling of gun smoke and rain, I ran toward him in the great hall and found him collapsing into himself, blood on the floor, a gash in his side. I ran because I cannot not run toward people who are breaking. I pressed compress to wound and felt the man who had issued orders and signed death certificates now dimly, vulnerably, alive and needing me in a way that had no ledger. "Don't ever risk yourself for me," he whispered. His voice was small against the vastness of the house. I said the brash truth I had learned in emergency rooms. "You are worth more than fear." He smiled like a man rediscovered. And we wrapped a fragile truce around the one night where no one tried to pretend everything was composite. The house hummed and nodded and whispered. I tended his wounds and watched the way his body accepted care, as if it found in my hands a chance at something he had never been allowed. He was dangerous and tender in a collection of moments that made me both fiercely angry and helplessly protective. It was an awful, messy education in loving the thing that was likely to destroy you. Living in a mansion that's a gilded cage is learning to measure small freedoms. Which doors actually lock, which windows open, which servants will meet your eyes and which will not. The house had an architecture of power. High ceilings, thick curtains, corridors that swallowed sound. Within it, life created its own economy of gestures. I learned the schedule of footsteps like a song. I cataloged the places where noise meant trouble and silence meant nothing at all. My role relaxed into a peculiar rhythm of caring and being watched. Each morning, I would make rounds in a room that was as much a surgery theater as it was a sanctuary for him. I bathed him with the unshakable focus of someone who had done this work for long enough to see patterns. When he slept, I would trace the scar on his side with the tip of my finger, the way a person reads Braille. Careful, searching, trying to transcribe the hidden lines. He would sit for hours in the drawing room with a book in his lap and the cat on his knee. The spectacle of him performing ordinary leisure made him human in a way his public persona never allowed. He would read aloud sometimes in a voice that folded the words like a contraband, poetry, the lines of a play, something soft that he had never been taught to choose. Then he would stand, and the house would tremble with the memory of his authority. He was the same man, both the tender reader and the kingmaker. Both were true at once. We were drawn into a pattern of small intimacies, a hand that reached for a teacup, and without thinking found mine. A foot brushing my ankle under a table in the kitchen as we argued about whether the dressing should be left on longer. It was ridiculous how domesticness could be used to disarm the soul. I tied to my apron the dangers of becoming complacent. There were moments I would find myself watching him more like a clinician than a woman. Note how he breathed, how his pulse thinned when he spoke, of his father. But then there were the moments he would rest his head in the crook of my shoulder and the universe would pretend not to be a ledger for a heartbeat. In that house was not the tidy thing seen in glossy magazines. It was a series of dirty negotiations, of compromises, of stolen gentleness. Once, after a tense day that had been stitched with the fog of a small, poisonous argument, he cornered me in the library. The hunt of him was quiet as a whisper. He closed the distance with a mouth that had once been quick with threats. This time, No threats, only an intent that made my breath hitch. Our kisses had learned to carry more than hunger. They learned to hold possibility, to press questions into answers. That night he kissed me long enough for the world to lose its edges. His hands moved like someone translating terror into something a little kinder. Clothes became incidental. The room smelled of old paper and lemon oil, and the kind of heat that makes time slow. What followed was not mechanical but intimate, not performative but honest. His touch was careful, not as if he feared breaking me, but as if he knew how fragile the world could be, and was trying to be the gentle instrument that didn't add to the damage. It was the kind of lovemaking that felt like a rehearsal for trust. Slow, deliberate, breath by breath. We touched the places in each other that had been carved by life. My shoulders where I kept knotted stress like small nodules. His ribs where the bullet had made a valley. And in the quiet small thing there was this strange surrender. Two people deciding, for a time, to be human with one another. The intimacy after that night was quieter and more complex. We began to share private rituals. He would bring me coffee made precisely how I liked it, and leave it on the table with a small note. I'd fold the notes into my medical charts, silly trophies of a life I hadn't meant to keep. I would read to him sometimes, and he'd listen with a focus that made the text brighter. He asked about my family, rare questions, as if seeking a geography he had not been invited into. When the war that had always simmered at the edges of our lives licked closer, and the La Serpiente boys tried an amateurish raid one late night, the house showed us the cost of intimacy. The alarms rose like a hunted orchestra and men ran like ghosts. I found myself pressed against the wall of the great hall, my hands clenched around bandage kits, watching as the men who were part of this life pitched themselves like dominoes against the assault. I fearlessly moved because the woman in me who had been trained to save could not act. He fought like an animal with the world on his shoulders, a man whose life had trained him for this choreography. And somewhere, suddenly and without fanfare, I dove in front of a bullet meant for him because you don't calculate those things when your body remembers what it has been trained to do. Pain ripped across my arm in a hot column. He threw himself into my space, anger and fear making his face a map of war. I could see in his eyes, stripped of the varnish of reputation, a kind of tenderness I had not known I could be the object of. He carried me to the infirmary with a gentleness that was almost shy. As he stripped back my sleeve, his fingers trembled with a care so precisely unkingly that it was almost comical if it weren't so devastating. He did not shout orders. He simply set to the task of keeping me still and warm and alive. In that room, amid bandages and antiseptic, the narrative of us reordered. I was not merely the healer. I was part of his private archive of people whose lives mattered to him in a way that no ledger could translate. In the nights after, we moved closer, sometimes like conspirators, and sometimes like two people attempting to stitch a fabric that had been threaded with barbs. There were small, violent arguments, rage as release, followed by softer touches, a thumb tracing the ridge of a scar, a forehead pressed to the back of a hand. We existed in a state of contradictory wholeness, both monster and tenderness in a single body. The house watched and kept score, but inside the small room where I tended him, our tenderness grew currency and refuge. When a man built his life on the logic of power, the smallest things that look like softness can feel like a surrender or a trap. We had learned to build moments of domestic tenderness between meetings and threats, and yet something in the world rejected the peace we tried to cultivate. The Moretti name is not neutral. There are always people who mistook softness for weakness and would exploit it like a seam. The argument that preceded the glass smash was stupid and honest and necessary. We had both said things that pushed at old wounds. I called him heartless. He called me naive. The air thickened until the words were small missiles. In a fit of rage, I hurled a glass across the marble countertop, and it exploded into glitter and regret. He moved with the unerring speed of a man used to catching what falls. The glass was not a projectile he wanted to stop. He wanted to stop me. His hands found my wrists. He could have hurt me. Instead, he held firm and exact, not cruel but monumental. Our faces were an inch apart, his breath a hot fume against my ear. The world narrowed to a single, savage beat, and then he kissed me, a hard, immediate press of lips that took the argument out of me like a splinter. The kiss was not gentle. It was needing folded into wanting. I I tasted whiskey and blood and the faint ash of a life that burned too fast. We made love in the hush that follows a storm. It was fierce and careful in turns, as if each of us were moving on a field that had mine shafts and traps where trust should have been. His body was all angle and old muscles. Mine was the instrument of steady work. Our lovemaking was an odd fusion of bruised tenderness and urgent private hunger. He was not a candle to be used to illuminate me. He was a match struck to keep us both from the cold. There was a comment of consent between us, spoken words pulled between breaths, boundaries set and honored. It felt like a covenant, small, imperfect, dangerously human. Sex in that house was, like everything else, ambivalent. It was an escape and an entrenchment. It made me complicit, and it made me loved in tiny gestures that were not public record. It was also the honest currency that would later explain things which no amount of public ledger could. The war outside did not respect our new contract of gentleness. La Serpiente escalated their pressure with a dangerous patience designed to empty him of advantage. The mansion became a fortress, staff filling battlements of furniture and looking like an army of domestic soldiers. I prepared kits and moved through the house like a nurse who also learned battlefield triage. Men fell, the sound of gunfire lighting up rooms like detail on a film reel, and amid the chaos, I learned again that when you love someone, you enter a calculus that has no moral scale. In the last attack, the house was a furnace. Men ran like prey and orders cracked like thunder. I cannot describe with clinical calm the way the house smelled of burning and wet ash, and the sharp chemical tang of gunpowder that seems to remove everything safe from the air. Adrian fought like a man who had spent a life being remade into an instrument. He moved like a leader and like an animal, both at once. He took a bullet, one of many, and bled like any man does, which is to say, extravagantly and ordinary. I found him collapsed on the marble floor like a broken statue, and something in me split open with the rawness of a new grief I had not been asked for. I flung myself across the hall and felt his pulse as if someone had handed me a live wire and told me to make it quiet. He looked up at me with an expression I cannot name, shock, apology, a child's need, and said, in a voice that was too small for the room, "You healed what the world broke in me." I held compresses and applied pressure and felt the private terror of loving someone who kept his hands soiled with other people's ruin. We saved him that night with stitches and frantic hands and a kind of devotion no professional manual would recommend. He never asked for absolution. Instead, he pressed his burning forehead to mine and whispered, "I won't let you go." He survived, but the price of survival had been paid in ash and frightened men. The mansion smelled of smoke for weeks afterward. Men who had once stood like pillars of inevitability stumbled and did the uncomedic thing of being fallible. Our lives had been braided together with small, terrible threads. We both bore the marks. I with my patched arm and the memory of his eyes when he believed me gone that night. He with a raggedness that refused to be smoothed by bandages. In the quiet after battle, we held each other and argued about small things like domestic tyrants, whether a cut should be stitched now or later, and who would awake to check on the lower garden. The intimacy had become a thing we had to defend. We fought and made up and made love in ways that were tender and sometimes ragged. I forgave him for that night's brutality in private and withheld forgiveness in public. If I believed in anything, it was that the ledger would always be there. The house had been both a prison and a sanctuary. The line between those two had blurred. Men still made calculations about power in rooms I'd never visit. Business calls rearranged city blocks with the casualness of a man ordering dinner. But beneath the debris of constant negotiation, we had carved a small room of domestic warmth where, bizarrely, compassion began to feel like a counterpart to cruelty instead of its antithesis. The danger of loving him was that the heart keeps tally in a currency that neither law nor story understands. War is less like a single roar and more like a patient, cruel curriculum. It teaches small lessons over and over until you either learn them or break. La Serpiente had been testing Adrian for months. Little jabs, messages, a courier left at dawn with a headless note. We treated them like irritants until they weren't. Walls that have weathered a single storm can begin to show hairline cracks that, if ignored, will widen into chasms. The first attack I remember as a sound. A dull concussion that thudded through marble and bone. I was in the infirmary when the alarms began to make the house sound like an animal with a fever. We weren't surprised, only sick of the inevitability of it. The staff shifted into a mode I'd seen before, decisive movements, faces that spoke a language of ancient responsibilities. He rose with a kind of awesome mechanical grace and became the axis around which a small war turned. He moved like someone who had been taught to make decisions that cost lives. Men followed him because they had learned to follow him as a survival calculus. I ran because my training is reflex, and because fear makes your body obey a different set of rules. The great hall was a blur of shouting and movement, security yelling names, the crash of furniture, the small, sharp sound of glass surrendering to pressure. Men I had watched drink coffee at noon were suddenly running like children in a rainstorm, their faces stripped of trivialities. I found him amid it all, a figure carved out of decision and rage. He had a hole near his shoulder, another addition to the ledger of the body, and he moved like a man who had accepted that his flesh was merely the temporary vessel for a will. He barked orders with such economy that his voice felt like a weapon. People obeyed. And then, like the rest of us, he was caught by a nuance he had never accounted for. Me. An exchange of fire sent our world into slow motion. There is, in the middle of violence, a clarity so bright it hurts. The sudden quiet at the center, the violent choreography of bodies, the primal maths of who moves where for what. A shot took a guard, a second grazed the chandelier, and in the flash a bullet arced in a line that was not supposed to be there. It caught me in the arm. I had ducked for him because old reflexes die hard. I had been taught to protect life in that instant, even when the life in question was the kind that twisted the city. Pain announces itself with a white-hot clarity that is almost moral. I tasted iron. The world narrowed to the wet heat of my blood and the clinical task at hand. He lurched toward me like a man dragged by an anchor. He scooped me up in a motion that was more animal than king and carried me off the field as if I were both talisman and burden. "Don't ever risk yourself for me," he said in the first breath between us that was not an order. It broke something inside him. His voice was not expected to fracture the way it did. I wanted to tell him he was worth nothing for such a statement and everything for having said it. But words felt like fragile currency. I pressed a compress to my wound and watched him as gloved hands moved around us like a ritual. We treated the injuries in a back room that had become a triage center. Men lay like broken monuments, bleeding into the great carpets and into our memory. He watched quietly as I worked, patient in a way I had not seen him practice when it came to the small things that demanded softness. He did not touch. He watched my hands like someone reading a map. After the shots and the bandages and the triage, the house was quiet, in the way a city is after a storm, battered and bewildered. He would sit for hours after these events, his shoulders framing the silhouette of a man who had been carved by other people's expectations and hardened by them. I would find him sometimes with his elbows on his knees and his forehead pressed into his hands as though trying to squeeze out decisions like a fruit. He did not always talk. When he did, it was in small pieces. One evening in the wake of another raid, after the floors had been swept and the men filing reports, I sat with him in a small library that smelled of dust and tea. The house had gone into a lull, and the city outside made its distance known in a siren's faint cry. The room was dim. The lamplight painted the dust like tiny constellations floating in a thrown-away universe. He rubbed the back of his neck and said, "You should not have been there. I should have been a nurse who had seen better boundaries." Instead, I found myself honest and ugly and true. "I could not stand by," I said. "That is what I do." He looked at me then, in a way that quieted the small argument I had in my head about ethics and professional lines. "You always make me want to be less of what I have been," he told me, and a small choke rose up my throat that had nothing to do with the cut on my arm. It was gratitude and admission wrapped in a tight package. What happened after that night was not a dramatic burst, so much as a slow folding in. We spent time together in the small hours. He read to me from musty books, his voice low and rough, and I cooked him food that tasted of stability. We had made love in the weeks before, touches that moved from need to tenderness. Yet now there was something else, a tether that was less about possession and more about dependency. He needed me in ways that made him human. I needed him in ways that frightened me. One night, after a quiet evening and too many cigarettes in the service yard, we found ourselves in the old sitting room where the fireplace spat small embers into the dark. He came to me with a kind of deliberate slowness that made the world hush. He was less king than a man who had learned how to be careful. We kissed first, gentle and searching, and then the kiss grew into something more intimate. Our hands had learned patterns of tenderness. His lips were patient and his hands immediate, learning the cartography of my skin as I learned his new map. The old scars, the new vulnerabilities, the places the bullet had left like quiet punctures in his ribs. We moved with an understanding that had less to do with romance than with mutual rescue. The lovemaking that followed was soft and fierce in turns. It felt like a rite we were performing for ourselves to say we were still capable of giving and accepting kindness. In those hours, the world simplified in a dangerous and irresistible way. We were not simply a Mafia heir and a kidnapped nurse. We were two people trying, desperately and imperfectly, to stitch one another into some semblance of health. Some nights were tender. Others were rough with the old tendencies he carried: control, quick temper, an inclination to claim. But even in the roughness, there was consent and a kind of searching gentleness that left me both sated and wary. The war progressed like a malign teaching. Each attack left new sutures in the walls and in the men walking them. I began to understand in a way I had not before that violence was both external and internal. He fought others, and he fought himself. The city hummed and rearranged, deals were made in back rooms, and people changed allegiance not because of ideology, but because of the smell of survival. One morning after a particularly sharp attack, I woke with his hand around mine and a thin, brave smile. He looked at me like someone who had been granted a small, private victory. "You'll leave one day," he said, not as a threat but as a quiet acceptance. "I might," I answered. My voice sounded small against the vastness of the house, but not today. He tightened his hand like an anchor, and I knew then that the ledger of our lives would be complicated in ways that had no easy accounting. Confession is a small instrument. Sometimes it's a trumpet blast, sometimes a whisper in a dark room. When he began to unspool the history of his father, the hands that trained him, the lessons that made him efficient in cruelty, I listened the way a surgeon listens to the murmur of a failing heart. He told the story not because he sought absolution, but because he needed his history acknowledged. A man's past, once said aloud, becomes less powerful. It is a theory you can examine. The rain had a steady tick that night, the kind that makes lamps halo, and the world feel like it is being simmered. We were in the small infirmary. I had arranged the instruments and lit a lamp. He sat on the edge of a chair with his head bowed, a posture that makes size irrelevant and leaves you human then small. "I was taught to be sharp," he said. "My father measured everything in losses and survival, and taught me to value the second." He spoke as if he were recounting a clinical history. "I was trained to be decisive. You made choices," I said. "Those choices cost other people." He did not deny it. He could not. He had been built in part out of the calculus of survival. He told me of the first raid he had watched happen from a shadow, of the sound of rifles and the way the men moved like wind. He told me of the times he had closed his eyes and let mechanics of violence do the thinking for him. And then he said the small thing that would shift the furniture in my chest. "I didn't know he was your brother." The confession arrived with a vulnerability I had not expected. I had learned to separate the man I cared for in private from the man who signed orders in public, but truth refuses to be split that neatly. The room felt thinner after he said it, as if the walls had less capacity for denial. We did not settle it with argument. Instead, we settled into something that felt like the only honest remedy. We spoke, and then we touched, and then we loved. Not as a distraction, but as a deliberate choice to be present with one another amid the ruins. That night, after the confession had bled itself into the dry dust of the air, had become a part of our shared history, he took my hand in silence and led me to a window where the rain made a baroque curtain of the outside world. He did not ask. He did not plead. He merely stood and watched the aversive weather, and when he turned back to me, his face was open in a way that had seldom been permitted. We kissed then, slow and searching. But the kiss was not just a gesture of intimacy. It contained an admission. We were two adults who had decided to make a warm, human thing in the exact middle of chaos. The lovemaking that followed was both urgent and reverent. We moved together with a tenderness that had been earned through shared storms. Strokes that were not businesslike, but full of the kind of curiosity that builds trust. We whispered names, not as possession, but as acknowledgement. He asked me to tell him how I felt. I answered the truth with a quietness I hadn't given anyone. We weren't reckless. We were clear. We spoke consent like prayer. "Are you sure?" he asked in the middle of a breath. And I said yes. Not the flicker of impulse, but the slow, considered agreement of two people who understood the terrible stakes. He was careful with me as he had never been with anyone else, perhaps because the man who taught him force had never taught him how to be careful. He tried to learn, fingers memorizing the arches and hollows he had never been taught to speak gently to. Afterward, we lay tangled in a hush of warm linen and breath, the rhythm of the rain a modest hymn. He traced the map of my shoulder with a thumb that shook a little. He tucked a stray curl behind my ear with a tenderness so private it felt like sacrament. "Thank you," he said then, and the word was ridiculous and real and marked the room. For the next few days, we were careful around each other like people who had crossed a threshold and could not yet be certain of the ground. There were more kisses, quieter in the morning light, and touches that communicated rather than claimed. There was intimacy in small practicalities. Him bringing a cup of tea brewed precisely the way I liked it. Me cleaning a stubborn bruise with the thoroughness of someone who respects what needs to be healed. It was in those small, repeated acts that something invisible happened. We were not dramatic about it. There was no single cinematic moment where the world paused and declared our fate. The thing grew the way a bruise forms, slowly, under the skin. Our bodies, our nights, our conversations intertwined until the plausibility of new life settled into the room like the perfume of lemon oil after cleaning. There was no single time I could point to and say, "Here." Instead, I remember a series of very human nights and a morning when I noticed some tenderness had turned into a memory that would rearrange everything. The confession had been a kind of unspooling that made him human in a way newspapers never could. The lovemaking that followed grew into habit and into refuge. It also placed us in a new kind of danger. The intimacy we sought to salvage ourselves with had the side effect of creating a life neither of us planned for. When I think back, I can trace it in small loops. A laugh in the dark, a hand sliding over a hip, a sleep shared in the quiet before dawn. Life manages to curve around the most violent arcs and occasionally plants something new in the soil that violence created. We had no guarantees. He had no promise of redemption. I had no clean map for forgiveness. But in those nights, heavy with rain and words and the small, faithful motions of two people trying to remake themselves, something began that would demand an accounting later. It would require more than words to explain, and yet our hands, against the cold of the rooms, had begun the work. Secrets have the peculiar property of being patient. They do not always shatter on first contact. Sometimes they sit beneath the surface of a lifelike sediment, and only when something upends the world do they wash out into full view. I had been living with fragments of a life's past, my brother's laugh, a childhood balcony where Basil grew wild, the sudden, sober call that had told me he was gone. I had been holding the shape of his absence like a talisman, less to forget than to keep the delicate architecture of my life from collapsing. One afternoon, as rain threaded the edges of the world again, I overheard two of his men in the corridor, a conversation I did not mean to catch, a ledger made of casual facts. They spoke of raids and targets, of logistics couched in language meant to soothe conscience. A name slipped from one like a stone, my brother's name. My body reacted before my mind could file the phrase into something sensible. The world tilted. I replayed everything after that in a furious, systematic accounting. My brother had died in a raid. The people who had organized that raid were the people who ran the house I had been forced into. Adrian's name, the man's voice, the clean factuality of the men in the corridor, these converged into a truth that felt like a blade against the back of my throat. I confronted him with the professional. Outward calm I had honed for years, directness first, a refusal to wallow in melodrama. He did not deny the specifics. He offered the sort of explanation people give when they have spent their lives making trade-offs on other people's flesh. It was war, he said. We hit a cell. I didn't know your brother was in the wrong place. The words fell like a clumsy accounting. I wanted to ask why my brother had been catalogued as an expendable variable in his calculations. I wanted to ask how he could live in a world that made such calculus necessary. I wanted to burn the room with my anger and his acceptance of it. Instead, I felt the blood drain from the world's color and a quiet pooling in the base of my stomach. The house seemed to twist. I left him then, because there are gestures that are necessary when the truth is wild and ugly, and you need space to place it in. I moved through rooms that once felt like the map of my routines, and now looked like an enemy's topography. I packed the small items a person takes when they are not certain of staying. Bandages, a blouse, the little things that become anchors. We did not have a proper fight about this. We had what felt like tectonic plates grinding. He did not offer a theatrical apology. He told me facts. Facts are sharp and cheap things when people have been killed. You want me to do what? He asked finally in a voice that was both tired and brittle. Tell the truth, I said. Tell them your mistake. Let those you hurt make their choices. He had always been good at measuring cost. He paused as if calculating. The ledger was not just his to write. It extended into the lives of men who had followed him because they had no alternative. It was not the sort of calculus that yields easy, penitent gestures. He did what he could in private ways. There was no great public confession. Power does not usually give up its robe in public unless compelled by forces that exceed it. But he told those closest to him the truth in quiet meetings that smelled of tobacco and regret. He staggered under the weight of it in a way that made him small for a time. The consequences were messy and real. Men who had once nodded like obedient branches now stared blankly at the ledger of their own complicity. Other houses in the city moved like predators smelling the weakness and made offers less concerned with idealism than with opportunity. My brother's name was a bell that would not stop ringing. For me, the truth shifted the shape of everything. Where there had once been fragile tenderness, there was now a jagged, raw fissure. I vacillated between wanting to rip him apart for what had been done, an actionable fury, and wanting to sit in the ruins with him to try and understand if a man can be taught new moral muscles. I oscillated like someone on a razor. We continued to be near each other because proximity had already formed a habit. We moved in the rooms where our intimacy had taken shape, the kitchen where he made coffee for me, the infirmary where I cleaned his wounds. There were moments of wariness and moments of shared glances, an odd human duet of grief and tenderness. The man who had once been the source of a deep, humiliating softening inside of me had been irrevocably implicated in my private pain. The house changed around me. Men who had been loyals moved like weather, and alliances shifted the way tides adjust to the moon. There were advantages and dangers to staying in proximity. I learned to count exits again, and I watched him like someone observing a complicated animal. He seemed to carry the weight of his choices like someone carrying wet wood up a hill. It slowed him and made him more vulnerable than I had previously been willing to acknowledge. I did not forgive him in a single gesture. Forgiveness was a slow calculus, and I was not sure I wanted to be generous. Yet the parts of me that were a nurse, trained to see the wounds and the infection and to treat them, kept me within the orbit of someone I could not wholly abandon. The truth had broken something between us, but it had also revealed a new terrain. There was work to be done, in the world and in ourselves. Whether that work would become redemption or another shape of ruin remained to be seen. If war is weather, the final attack on the mansion was a tsunami arriving at dawn. La Serpiente had been patient enough to wait for the fractures we had tried to conceal. They used the city's own rhythms against us, timings, inside knowledge, a leverage that came from knowing which men were absent and which windows were thrown wide for air. It was organized cruelty delivered with professionalism. We prepared, but preparation is never the same as survival. The staff moved into positions like people who had been practicing a drill for years. Cooks pressed into emergency care. Drivers forming human barricades, guards stacking themselves like living fences. The house smelled like oil and lemon and the metallic fug of fear. I had my medical bag slung over my shoulder, and the small, private prayer that the violence would stay outside the doors. They came at dusk like wolves that had learned to mimic the shape of friends. Explosions rattled the fixtures, men shouted in tongues of anger, and the chandeliers trembled in a way that made them seem alive. The corridors that had been my routine were suddenly a geography of peril. A wrong turn meant being unseen and not being heard again. I ran and tended and bandaged and swore and lost my breath and acted in the strict economy of keeping people alive. He fought with a terrible grace, an awful choreography that made you feel both drawn and disgusted. Men fell, and the house took them like an appetite. I stitched and patched and felt the world reduced to the immediate mathematics of life. Apply pressure, find pulse, close wound. There is a narrowness to such moments that is almost religious. A prayer you make with gloves and gauze. A shot struck him in a place that made the world tilt. I am trained to keep calm. I am trained to do work with a surgeon's focus, but when he fell, my equilibrium collapsed. I threw myself across the marble and felt the shock of his warmth and the sickly, hot taste of blood. He gripped my hand with a force that was both asking and claiming, and in that moment the house's grandeur meant nothing. "You idiot," I told him, my voice a quick, messy ribbon. The phrase was practical and intimate and useless all at once. A part of me wanted to shout at the universe. Another part wanted to kneel in the spilled light and never move again. I pressed compress to his wound and felt the heavy, ridiculous weight of loving someone who had been the cause of so much ruin for other people. We dragged him to a quieter room. The emergency plans had a spare chamber for this eventuality, and I stitched and suture and prayed in the language of someone who had spent a life learning how to make incisions and to close them without scaring, more than absolutely necessary. He opened his eyes and looked at me as if hoping to find purchase in my face. "You healed what the world broke in me," he rasped. The confession was small as a coin, but heavy enough to sink islands. We held. We loved in broken, furious ways in the hours between decisions about defenses and the arguments men had in the smoke-filled corners about recruits and betrayals. Sometimes we laughed like people who had been given absurd second chances. Sometimes we wept like people who had been stripped. The house smelled of burned paper and the sweetness of coffee brewed by hands that had known fear. As dawn peeled itself through the curtains, I realized the fight had changed the people in the house irrevocably. Men who had seemed unbreakable looked like weathered stone. The Moretti influence tilted, and the city would rearrange itself accordingly. Some men would bow, and new ones would arrive to take positions of power. Some would leave, broken. War eats everything until it is sated. When it was over, there was no glorious victory. There was only the slow accounting, bodies to be moved, wounded to be tended, names to be whispered like litany. He survived that night, barely, and the cost was ineffable. The thing war never properly addresses is the slow erosion of the soul when you make choices that cost other people. I learned that night how to hold a man between a bed and the world, and to love in that small, exhausted space. I sat with him as the light grew, and in the quiet hours of the aftermath, I watched a man who had been carved by cruelty and tenderness in equal measure breathe and try to be less of the instrument he had been made into. He would never be free of the ledger. Men cannot simply erase a life of actions with a single confession, but in the slow, ragged wake, he allowed something like softness to take root. We had choices again, though the options felt slim. Leave and survive, or stay and be embroiled. War had a price. Sometimes it demanded the currency of lives. We had paid a portion of it. The rest would perhaps be accounted for by the sort of slow, stubborn acts that rewrite the edges of who you are. For now, we were still standing. They tell you a lot about dying in medical school, technically, clinically, but nothing prepares you for the small, absurd intimacies of it. Death is not a great curtain that falls with fanfare. Most of the time, it is a slow, intimate rearrangement of breaths and the soft business of letting go. I had watched patients die in fluorescent rooms, under the impartial hum of machines. Those deaths were procedural, wrapped in protocols. What I was about to live through with Adrian was not a lesson. It was an unclassifiable, private cyclone. After the last battle, the mansion smelled permanently of smoke and wet ash. Men who had once commanded rooms by posture now shuffled like strangers through corridors where chandeliers hung like slow moons. The house had been hit in ways it would not completely forget. A burned curtain here, a crack in a banister there, a subtle permanent tilt to how the staff moved. We had tended wounds and mended doors and rearranged the whole small economy of the place to keep the rest of it functioning. There had been funeral plans murmured in the corners and hands that trembled in places where brass had once been polished clean. He lasted days longer than anyone had predicted, and in that strange mercy I found a terrible, absurd hope that was equal parts selfish and human. I slept in the chair at the end of his bed for more nights than I can count now, the wood biting into my knees, but my mind utterly unable to leave the small field of his breathing. I learned his every breath the way a child learns a lullaby. The shallow intake when pain lanced, the long, ragged exhale when sleep came. He was a man who had built empires and buried men and could now be minimized by a thread of biology no amount of money could override. On the morning the end came, the sky had that merciful flatness that seems to apologize for everything. I was rubbing at a stubborn bruise along his forearm when he opened his eyes and looked at me like a man who had been surprised into sobriety. His pupils were clear and small in the soft light. "Elena," he said, and his voice was not the danger I had trained against for months. It was something small and particular, as if the consonants were being tasted for the first time. I bent close. "I'm here." He reached for me in that slow, deliberate way of someone who has been re-taught how to hold a fragile thing. His fingers found the small hollow of my waist and lingered. It was an automatic, territorial gesture that was also suddenly tender. He cleared his throat, a poor actor trying to get through a line. "You carry something," he said. "You told me once something that made me wish different things." The words tumbled slow. For a moment the room suspended on them like a bird on a wire. I understood without being surprised. The nights before had rearranged us both into a map that had a place for a child to be conceived. It had been small and private, and not at all the kind of thing a ledger could catalog. But to hear him say it then, when his fingers were warm and failing, altered the gravity of everything. He reached out and placed his palm flat, with a clumsiness that made my throat catch, over the curve of my belly in the way someone leaves a handprint on a tree trunk. "You carry my son," he said. I laughed then, because the world had been so sharply sincere, and because there is always a ridiculous human reflex to respond to terror with humor. It came out thin and broken, and then dissolved into a cry I could not steady. The gesture was as intimate and as obscene as anything I'd done. The man who had ordered men into graves was resting his last breath on the site of a future. "You'll be better than me," he added. The sentence of prayer and a fear, and perhaps the best thing he could articulate at a time when his hands no longer obeyed him. He touched the fabric of my blouse like a rosary and closed his eyes. Breath slowed. A monitor on the bed's frame kept a metronomic tick that sounded like a small, indifferent god at the corner of a room suddenly too full of meaning. We used to speak about absolution in abstract ways. Books and poems he would allow me to read aloud, his head tucked into a pillow, the lamplight making him look like any other dying man in a room that smelled of soup and orange rinds. But this was not abstract. This was the absolute. A man I had loved and hated and tended was burning out in a slow, holy flame. I pressed my palm to his, then rested my forehead against the back of his hand as if to anchor him to me. He clutched my fingers like someone trying to hold onto a rope, and maybe find an angle where forgiveness and acknowledgement met. The nurses who had been retained on his staff drifted in and out like shadow figures, offering sterile touches and mechanical instructions. We did everything by the book, and then some. Warmed blankets, corrected fluids, kept his lips moistened. But the real work was in the small human ministrations. Stories whispered, a thumb tracing a scar like a benediction, the kind of private jokes that make the dark a little less unbearable. I read a bit of nonsense from a book of poems, and he smiled faintly. "Stubborn human," he whispered. And the joke was an intimacy we shared that had nothing to do with the ledger or the men who kept his accounts. His breathing thinned as afternoon became something approaching evening. The house seemed to lean toward us. People in uniforms walked quieter, as if the mere sound of ordinary life might be too much to bear. He opened his eyes with the hazy focus of someone slipping gently down a slope. "Elena," he said again. "Say the name." I said it softly, the way you might say Amen. "Elena." He exhaled and then, like someone giving up a small secret, he said, "Promise me something. Teach him to choose kindness." There is something about a dying man's request that is both small and absolute, as if the last catalog of a life is no longer about inventory but about hope. I could not promise to fix the world. I could only promise to try. I pressed my other hand over his and felt the faint warmth that would soon retreat. "I promise," I told him. hearing the lie and the truth twinned together in the same breath. He smiled then, an effort that seemed to hollow and soften his face at once, and whispered, "Then go on." Those words were both permission and surrender. He let his eyes close after that, and the breathing grew thinner, and then there was a long, slow exhale that sounded like something finally being released after too much weight, had been carried for too long. I realized in a way that is hard to describe without cheap analogies that there is an absolute loneliness in the moment a man dies. All the reasons and the ledgers and the power evaporate into a hush where nothing matters but the small human details. The tilt of a chin, the pause in a breath, the uselessness of all previous positions. I had loved him with the terrible, contradictory heat of someone who had held both his tenderness and his cruelty. When his chest stilled, the room felt both emptied and irreparably full. They called the necessary men. The house rearranged itself into protocol again. Men with faces that had learned to be steely, statements to be made, arrangements to be planned. The Moretti world would have to count its losses, redistribute its power, and sign the papers that would make the abstract consequences real. I watched the men who used to follow his footsteps move like ghosts around the room, their faces a tapestry of brokenness and calculation. When the smoke cleared, figuratively, the house would smell of it for months. I sat on the floor with his hand still in mine, my palm pressed to the small curve of my belly where his fingers had been. The child moved then, a tiny, obstinate jolt like a secret communicated from inside. The motion made me laugh through my grief, a sound that was too small and savage and bright all at once. I had lost a man and gained a life in a single breath. The city outside would keep talking about power and the fate of houses and deals. The world would keep measuring what the Moretti name meant. But inside the small room there was a new arithmetic. One life had become two. The man who had been a devil in the public eye had left, with a final private insistence on tenderness, a mark that would not be expunged by law or gossip. In the days that followed, the house rearranged itself in formal ways. Men resigned, argued, consolidated. Some left quietly. Some plotted. The empire he had held did not vanish at his death. It transmogrified into other arrangements. Men who had been footprints on his carpet learned to step with their own intentions. I watched it all from a distance that felt both dismissive and intimately painful. I had an angle that their calculations could not reach. I held my belly and felt the child turn. And I understood that this was no longer simply about the past. This was about the future, mine, the child's, and whatever fragile goodness I might teach into being. I left the mansion barefoot one dawn, ash and wet dust under my feet, the smell of smoke sticking stubbornly in my hair. The sky was thin and pallid, as if the world itself were still recovering from a fever. I walked until the sea made sense to me. That vast, indifferent mirror that does not make promises but accepts everything in its shallow arms. I had carried a man's last breath and the knowledge of a life inside my belly. My future had been forced into a shape I had not planned for, but as the waves pulled at the ash on my soles, I understood, deep in some small, narrow place, that the child I carried would be given a life that I could shape, that I owed kindness to this new human more than any ledger demanded. The Moretti name would not be erased by the hush of the mansion. Histories are stubborn, but in the hush of that last hour, his last hand had given me something that could not be filed away. They say that time heals, which is a cruel thing to say to someone who has to learn the anatomy of grief. Time does not so much heal as it layers. A crust of ordinary moments settles over trauma and makes new routines possible. You learn to breathe in fractions again. The days shift from being all jagged edges to a mix of soft domesticity and the occasional tidal pain that comes with a memory. I left the mansion, deliberately, with the kind of measured steps that feel like a person inventing her life as she walks. I chose a small flat by the sea. Nothing theatrical. Just a place with a balcony, paint peeling off the sills, and mornings that smelled of coffee and brine. The move itself was an exercise in practical grief craft. Pack the things that matter, my nursing bag, his anonymous book of poems, a photograph of my brother I kept face down in a drawer, and leave everything that only belonged to the ledger behind. I used a different name on the lease because anonymity is sometimes the only shield you get when the world knows too many names. Pregnancy is a strange companion. It is at once a private calendar and an inconvenient broadcast. Your body changes in small, insistent ways. It makes needs you can't pretend away, and it insists that you plan. The first real evidence was not a test, but the small habitual movements. The way my belly would nudge at a spoonful of soup, the tiny flutter that made me laugh in a market in the middle of the day. The other times were in nocturnal moments when the child seems to rearrange his or her position in the dark, and you feel both awe and paralyzing fear. I learned to be tender with myself because tenderness, it turns out, is practical when you carry a life inside you. I told myself the story I would tell the child in the future. Simple truth, with no apology. His father was complicated and capable of harm, and also, in private rooms, and at the end of his breath, capable of asking to be less a weapon. I would not sanitize or mythologize. I would teach the child complexity. I would teach them kindness as both a practice and a political act. The first months were a delicate choreography of small joys and necessary boundaries. I saw my midwife and kept my appointments. I learned which groceries made my stomach turn and which made it bloom. I began to make lists for the child with the ceremonious absurdity of someone inventing a future. We went to the sea as often as I could, and I would press my palm to my belly and whisper nonsense names and silly promises. The baby kicked once when I told a joke aloud, which felt for reasons I could not entirely explain, like the universe approving. Money and power rearranged themselves at a distance. The Moretti name survived in backroom whispers and thin newsprint columns. Relatives I had not known slid envelopes under my door once, furtive and timid, other times blunt and demanding. Men who had been forced to recalibrate made their moves and their bargains and their deals. The city adjusted, as cities do, and new names took old rooms. I kept a careful distance from that world. I leaned into the life I was choosing. Simpler, quieter, built by hand and patient decisions. There were lonely nights. Once or twice I would wake with the old reflexive urge to run to him, to stand at the bed's end and make everything right. The ache was a lesson in itself. I learned to anchor that sadness into something practical. I folded the baby laundry. I practiced lullabies that sounded like the reading I had grown fond of with him. The paradox was endless. A man taken because of his choices had left a life in me that demanded my absolute tenderness. When the child was born, small, loud, and gloriously demanding in equal measure, the world, for an instant, rearranged into a manageable miracle. Labor is an act of physics and poetry. It is an ugly, miraculous composition of endurance and gasps. The moment I held him to my chest, the noise and the ache and the long, weary months of grief collapsed into something that tasted like salt and mercy. His hand wrapped around my finger like a tiny fist of truth. I named him something unassuming and strong, a name that did not invoke empires. I wanted him to own his story and not inherit a map he did not choose. Parenthood is more mundane than legend. Nights awake, boiled bottles, small bruises, the way you panic when they cough. It is also the quiet joy of a hand that sleeps curled over your heart while the world rushes on. I learned to measure my days by his breathing and my small victories by his smile. I read to him like I used to read to Adrian in the lamplight, only now the words were soft and provisional and honest. I told him about choices and consequence, about men who do terrible things, and about the possibility of being other than your past. People sometimes asked me if I held bitterness, or if I forgave him. The answer was complicated. Forgiveness is not an event, but a practice. Some days I was furious and wanted justice in public. Other days I forgave him in private for the small act he had given me. A life. Both feelings could coexist without dissolving me. I taught the child that complexity is allowed. We are not required to be clean. We are required to try. There were men from the old life who tried to make contact in clumsy ways. Offers of money, apologies that were thin currency, quiet comments that presumed entitlements. I refused most of it. I used my training, the steadiness that medical practice had given me, to construct firm boundaries. I learned to say no in ways that preserved my peace. Sometimes, in the soft collapse of evenings, I would walk with the child in a wrap against my chest and feel the sea like a learning companion. We would stand and watch the gulls and the small children who ran bare-legged and free, throwing them a look that was equal parts envy and gratitude. The life I had chosen was not the one I had planned at 23, but it was mine, and it was stubbornly honest. I had loved and lost and saved and given, and now I protected a small human at the center of all of that. Years later, when the city had mostly moved on and new names had settled into old places, my son would ask about his father. He would ask about men who had been monsters and sometimes, occasionally, worthy of complexity in private rooms. I would tell the truth in a way a nurse does, clear, kind, insistently practical. I would tell him about the moments of tenderness that had been given freely, and about the ledger of actions that could not be undone. I would teach him patience with other people's contradictions and courage to choose otherwise. Sometimes, late at night, when the house was quiet and the child slept in the small hollow of my arm, I let myself imagine small things. A garden the kid could learn to hoe, a library with books we loved, a life that did not revolve around fear or revenge. I learned that survival is not the same as thriving. Thriving is the labor of choice. If I had to measure the arc of those years in a single bruise or a single blessing, I would choose the morning I first felt his small fist curl around my finger, and the first time he laughed at a ridiculous thing, one of the old jokes Adrian and I had whispered in the lamplight. There was no simple redemption, no ledger cleared, but there was, impossibly, a kind of small, stubborn beauty. A life had been made, and I would teach it, with all the imperfect tenderness I owned, to be better than what had begotten it. The sea keeps calling in long, patient notes. Sometimes I stand at the shore and think of all the things I have carried and all the weights I have laid down. There is ash in the silt of my shoes, memory in the pocket of my jacket, and a child who tugs at my hand when the waves make the world feel too wide. He is to me the small miracle I was given to guard. You will be kinder, I whisper to his sleeping back, and the sea makes no promises but continues to gather and give. I keep my promise in the small daily ways, food made with hands that know how to heal, words chosen with the gentle precision of someone who has learned that mercy is a practice, not a transaction.